While working in the Middle East and South Asia, I could see and feel the impact of climate change all around. Human migration, the desertification of agricultural land, and water stress in places like India, Afghanistan, and Iraq. On a particular trip to India, I was awestruck by the overcrowding in Delhi, the masses of people, the traffic and car exhaust, and the pungent smell of human excrement wafting from side streets. Later, I was equally struck by how dry it was in the rural areas. A colleague later explained to me that the desertification of farmland was driving many people from rural areas into urban ones for new work opportunities. Now fast forward to 2012, and a big life-changing event happened to me personally. My beloved grandmother passed away and left my family's historic farmstead to me. In 1795, my 5 times great-grandparents settled about 600 acres in the Catskill Mountain region of upstate New York. Originally, it was a dairy farm, and then it transitioned to a cauliflower farm. And while it went out of operation in the 1950s, the land was still part of my family's 200-year-old legacy. And as 8th generation, I was too nostalgic to sell. So I decided to say farewell to my life and work abroad and come home and settle here and raise my son. But having worked in societies with expanding deserts, I could never take for granted what I saw when I came home. How lush and green it was. How driving on the small, windy mountain roads, you could see ponds and lakes and rivers and streams at nearly every turn. And I remember thinking how fortunate we are to have so much arable farmland and such abundant water. But what I also observed were the growing number of farms going out of operation, going bankrupt, being sold and divided up for second homes or vacation homes for wealthy New York City residents. How could this happen at a time when global agricultural lands are shrinking, when global water supplies are dwindling, and when food shortages are expected to increase, when the world's population is expected to rise by another 2 billion people in the next 3 short decades? Now, pondering these questions led me to the following conclusion. America needs a new food shed. And only by building this new food shed can we address one of the most primordial challenges that our society will face in the decades to come in the context of climate change: food security. Now, according to the 2017 Census of Agriculture for America, it says that between 60 to 80% of the fruits and vegetables we consume every day here in America come from California alone. Our second major food supplier is the Midwest. That's what makes these regions our nation's food sheds. But the 4th National Climate Assessment Report, research from Cornell University, and even information from NASA's climatologists all tell us the same thing, that California and the Midwest are in trouble. Higher temperatures and heat stress in these regions are intensifying wildfires, like I'm sure you hear on the news all the time. They're depleting water supplies for irrigation and increasing the incidence of pests and diseases that affect crops and livestock. And together, they are increasingly causing negative crop yields. These regions simply cannot sustain current levels of agricultural production, nor can they feed an ever-expanding US population expected to increase by another 110 million in the next 30 years. So unless we change course, America will have a food security crisis upon us and skyrocketing food prices in just a few short decades. Now, we could continue to buy food from abroad, from places like Mexico or Brazil, but these same agricultural societies, especially in the global south, are facing even greater challenges to their agricultural productivity in the context of climate change and rising temperatures. And poorer countries will have an even harder time feeding their societies than wealthier ones like ours. Okay, so let's move past the doom and gloom, right? What then is the solution to America's impending national food security crisis? My proposition is that New York State is the answer. Climate models for the foreseeable future project improved conditions for agriculture in New York. Higher temperatures mean extended growing seasons and more rainfall for us. New York happens to be strategically located on a little corner of the globe that will continue to be water abundant. How fortunate. And in the words of my friend Julia Suarez from Cornell University, water is the most vital ingredient for plant health and food production. New York also happens to be strategically and geographically located on our nation's largest population centers, and that will support easy access to food. And finally, New York has a history of agricultural production with the potential for scaling up. So in sum, New York State can be America's next food shed to feed the Northeast Corridor by 2050. Now, before we get our hopes up that there's an easy fix to America's impending national food security crisis, we also have to acknowledge that this possibility is at present actually a faraway dream, given today's realities. First, the number of farms in New York has been on the decline for the last several decades. In Otsego County, where all of us are sitting tonight, there were 400 dairy farms 30 years ago. So I want to invite you as the audience. How many do you think we have today? Shoot out a few numbers. 50, 100, 80. Well, it's 66. Also in New York, we have a short growing season, and that limits the amount of food we can produce. We have our first snowfall in November and our last in May. Now compare that to California, where they have year-round sunshine and can easily produce 3 harvests a year. Also, in New York, our family-owned farms average about 300 acres. And that has kept us operating at a low economy of scale and made it difficult to compete in the context of national and global market forces, where big agribusiness has won the day. Now, compare our small farms to California and the Midwest, where it's not unusual to find 20,000 acre farms with developed supply chains that make it cheaper to transport product from one side of the country all the way to the other than it is for us to buy food from a farm next door. Also, the average age of farmers is 59. Many are retiring. And the younger generation isn't stepping up like it used to. The economy has changed, commodity food prices have dwindled, and many young people made the choice to leave the farm and look for better paying opportunity elsewhere. It's understandable. But without that younger generation stepping up, retiring farmers have to make the tough decision to sell their land, their only asset to take care of themselves in retirement. And that means we have less arable farmland preserved for farming. Finally, we are seeing some young, aspiring farmers ready to step in and pick up the mantle who didn't grow up on a multi-generation farm. But like their millennial peers, many of them are drowning in college loan debts and lack enough startup capital to start a new business or buy land at market prices. And they wonder, in today's economy, will my business turn a profit? Okay, so New York has huge potential, but we also have colossal challenges. Where do we go from here? It's simple. If we get going now, we can overcome these obstacles, leverage New York State's many blessings, and feed the Northeast by 2050. Here's the 7-step pathway for us to get there. 1. In today's get big or get out economy, we need to get increasingly smart about aggregation. Now, no one small farm in New York can feed millions of people across the Northeast, but lots of farmers banding together, aggregating their products can. An example of an aggregated business model would be my friend Ken Jaffe's business, Slope Farms. Now, Ken raises grass-fed beef on his farm, but he also buys beef from neighboring farms, puts it all together under his branding umbrella, and sells it to buyers in New York City at the volume that they need. And best of all, he gives a fair price to his neighbors. 2, we need more arable farmland back in production. That means we need to usher in lots of new beginning farmers and giving them all the support they need. A great example of this is recent New York State legislation that was just passed a few weeks ago that qualifies beginning farmers for student loan debt forgiveness programs. This is great. We need exactly more types of these programs. 3, we need research on market forces. What are all those millions of people across the Northeast eating? What do we have the capacity to produce? And how can we scale up production of those goods? Now, 4, we need to look at Holland as a model for running massive indoor growing facilities to help us overcome our short growing seasons. As espoused by Margaret Dragovich, who's actually the president of Hartwick College, here where we sit tonight, Holland feeds much of Europe through its mass greenhouses. What's to stop us from doing the same with smart new energy-saving technologies? 5, we need to consider how to close gaps in the food supply chain. Now, what do I mean by this? So it's not just the status of farms that we have to think about, but all those other businesses that help get food to market. The distributors and truckers, the food processing plants, the co-packers that package your food, the food storage warehouse facilities, and other such businesses that get food onto your grocery store shelves. Now, do we currently have enough affordable trucking in New York and across the Northeast to get food to market? As of now, the answer is no. We can't even feed New York City public school kids with local farm products. How are we going to feed the Northeast? We need big data to drive strategic business investment and planning for a strong food supply chain. And I can't emphasize this enough because too often the food supply chain gets left out of our conversations on supporting agricultural development. 6, we need public and private investment in New York's agriculture. We need leadership and long-term state planning. We need policy to align with this ambitious vision. Only by adopting a comprehensive vision and plan that's owned by state and local government leaders, the private sector, farmers, and communities alike can we realize accelerated growth in the agricultural sector. 7, and finally, we We need to prepare for climate adaptation to keep our food system resilient. Now, as I've explained, New York will continue to be water abundant. But research also tells us that weather extremes and flooding, like we saw with Hurricane Irene, will worsen, and that will impact our production capacity. So we need to think ahead about improving stormwater management systems, preventing soil erosion, and so forth. So in sum, New York State can be America's next foodshed by 2050. And if we can realize this vision, America's food security will be far more assured. I want to wrap by inviting you to join me in realizing this vision. If you're a New York State resident, call your state legislators and tell them you want to see New York State take a leadership role in becoming America's next foodshed by 2050 and invest in planning, policy, and resources to fulfill its potential. If you're a business investor, join me in recognizing that the future of agriculture is here and invest in us. Learn more about what your peer investors are doing. Examples: Slow Money, Dirt Capital, the Local Farm Fund, or the Chobani Impact Fund. And consider in the near term a social, not just a financial return on investment. If you're a consumer in the Northeast, talk to your local grocery stores and tell them to stock more product from New York and neighboring states in the Northeast. And finally, from wherever you are in America, from sea to shining sea, buy local, from a farm stand, a farmer's market, or a grocery store. All of you can help. Your voice and your wallets are your most powerful leverage for ensuring food security for yourselves, your children, and your grandchildren. I thank you.